Welcome to the story of Amelia Edwards' voyage, 1,000 miles up the Nile. I hope you enjoy Amelia's adventure. Today we're going to travel back in time, not just once, but twice. Our first step backwards is about 150 years. Long before moving pictures, audiences were entertained with magic lantern shows. Although I don't have a photo of Amelia giving a talk, here's a picture of American traveler John L. Stoddard presenting a lecture on Egypt using glass slides he took in 1874. Even then, the public's fascination with ancient Egypt was alive and well. Our second step backwards in time takes us thousands of years into the past, to the time when the pharaohs ruled ancient Egypt. This is a reconstruction of Luxor Temple, as it would have looked 3,500 years ago. Notice the size of the people walking through the temple doors. As you can see, the ancient Egyptians built very impressive monuments. Many of you are also familiar with Amelia Peabody, that fictional Victorian heroine whose adventures in Egypt are described in a series of books written by Elizabeth Peters, the pen name of the late Egyptologist Barbara Mertz. Tonight, however, I'll be talking about the actual person who inspired the Amelia Peabody stories, Amelia B. Edwards. Let's begin our journey through time. Amelia Edwards was a Victorian novelist, adventurous traveler, suffragette, and the very first woman Egyptologist. During my talk, I'll be your travel guide describing Amelia's exploration of Egypt. My wife, Jill, will be reading quotations from Amelia and her companions. As you hear Amelia's words spoken, I'd like you to imagine she's actually here with us, presenting her travel log. Amelia Edwards was born in central London on June 7, 1831. A few years later, the family moved to the nearby village of Islington, where she grew up. Her home at 19 Wharton Street still exists today. At 12 years of age, Amelia wrote and illustrated a story called Patrick Murphy.
I was bold enough to drop it at the office of Cruikshank's Omnibus, of which George Cruikshank was editor, artist, and proprietor. The next evening, he walked in while we were having tea, introduced himself, and asked to see the author and artist. When he found that the important personage was a little girl in a short frock, he was greatly amused.
Cruikshank, who later became Charles Dickens's most celebrated illustrator, offered to train Amelia as his apprentice. But fortunately for the future of Egyptology, Amelia's parents turned him down. By the time she was 21 years old in 1852, Amelia was writing for daily newspapers like the Saturday Review and the Morning Post. Charles Dickens was a close friend, and a number of Amelia's stories were published in his Christmas annuals. Amelia's best-known ghost story is The Phantom Coach.
I turned to the person beside me and saw, oh God, how can I describe it? I saw that he was dead. With a scream of terror, I threw myself at the door and tried to open it. Then the coach rocked and fell like a ship at sea. There was a tremendous crash, a terrifying sense of falling, and...
Well, you'll have to read it yourself to find out how it ends. In 1857, Amelia and her 20-year-old cousin Matilda undertook a grand tour of Europe, spending 4 months visiting France, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, and Germany. But in 1860, both Amelia's parents suddenly died within a week of each other. Amelia then moved in with two old family friends, Mr. and Mrs. Brasher, who lived in Kensington. 3 years later, after Mr. Brasher died, in 1863, Amelia and Brasher's widow Ellen moved from London to Westbury-on-Trim, about 3 miles north of Bristol. At her house in Westbury-on-Trim, called The Larches, Amelia set up a first-rate library where she could read, sketch and paint, and write her novels. Amelia's novels were very popular. Her last novel, Lord Brackenbury, was so successful and went to 15 editions. She estimated that it took 2 years to research the setting and background of each novel. This careful planning paid off financially, and by the late 1860s, her books were providing her with a very substantial income. In September of 1871, Amelia traveled alone to Italy, where she overwintered in Rome. What timing! On April the 25th, 1872, she witnessed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius from Naples. While in Naples, Amelia befriended Miss Lucy Renshaw, who was 2 years younger than herself. A few months later, Amelia and Lucy hiked the Dolomite Mountains in the Italian Alps. Their adventures were published in Amelia's travel book, Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys. Sources for my talk tonight include Amelia's biography, her books, and the diaries of two of her companions, Marianne Brocklehurst and Lucy Renshaw's maid, Jenny Lane. In September of 1873, Amelia began her journey with a vacation in central France, which would ultimately wind up in Egypt. Victorians did not travel lightly. A lot of clothing and equipment would be needed to be away for up to a year. 4 or 5 steamer trunks to hold bulky clothing, hats, scarves, shoes, dinner attire, and for the artist, notebooks, pencils and paints, easels, tablets, and sketching tents. This is a Google Earth view of the first leg of Amelia's journey via the Great Western Railway to central London, where she met up with Lucy Renshaw and her maid, Jenny Lane. Then it was on to Dover via the Southeastern Railway, on the second leg of their journey. And here's the third leg, by packet boat across the English Channel. The Dover-Calais packet boat took about 5 hours to cross the channel, depending on the tide and weather. Jenny comments,
It was a rather rough crossing. Miss Renshaw is a very good sailor, but Miss Edwards, like myself, feel like we are good for nothing.
Trains to Paris departed directly from the dockyard at Calais. Continuing on their journey, the rail line from Calais passed through Lille and Amiens before reaching Paris. After an overnight stay, the next morning, they left for central France on the PLM railroad. The ladies settled in at the Hotel de Royat, which was used as a base to venture out to see nearby sites. One site that fascinated them was the volcanic cinder cone called the Puy de Dôme. But all was not well, as Jenny comments.
10th day, September, Wednesday, a very wet day. Friday, a dreadful thunderstorm came on us before we reached the Puy de Dôme. Saturday, very wet, not able to go out. Monday, high winds and misty rain. Tuesday, very unsettled, wet and cold winds. Wednesday, cold and miserable.
The ladies spent the next 2 months exploring central France, occasionally in sunshine, but more often than not in the rain. By November, they were visiting the Roman ruins at Nile. Amelia says that she and Lucy
drifted to Egypt by accident. We headed to Egypt just to get out of the rain, for it had poured for a month without stopping during our vacation in central France.
Perhaps they were inspired to visit Egypt because Amelia had seen this PLM poster at the railway station in Nile, and also noticed the cute little pseudo-Egyptian PLM cartouches. By 1873, a luxury train called the Peninsular Express, owned by the same firm as the Orient Express, ran from Paris through a tunnel in the Alps to the south of Italy. To meet up with the Peninsular Express at Bologna, the ladies caught a local train, stopping to stay overnight in Marseille and then Genoa. Arriving at Bologna, Amelia, Lucy, and Jenny boarded the Peninsular Express bound for Brindisi. From Bologna, the train went east to San Marino. Overnight was spent in sleeper car berths. The next morning, the train followed the coast to Brindisi, where they arrived at 6 p.m. After staying at the Grand India and Oriental Hotel, Amelia, Lucy, and Jenny boarded the PLO ship Simla. Jenny says,
It is a splendid boat, 328 feet long and 40 feet wide, with about 100 passengers aboard. There are some particularly nice English people who are going to Cairo.
P&O ships plied the waters between Italy and Alexandria. In 1873, they were a combination of steam and sail. It took about 4 days to sail to Alexandria. On their crossing, they met and befriended Miss Marianne Brocklehurst and her party. Here's what it might have looked like on board their ship at the time Amelia made the crossing, if the weather had been fine. But the weather was not fine, and their crossing rough, as noted in Marianne's diary.
First day, storm clouds brewing. Second day, our cabin is all askew. Third day, end of the card party. Fourth and last day, in the saloon, tumblers flying, lamps smashed, and water coming in the skylight.
Jenny says it was
a horrible rough day, at times impossible to stand. A terrible night. It has been almost impossible to keep in bed.
Not fun. The port of Alexandria was, of course, the gateway to Egypt. When they arrived, the Simla was placed under quarantine for several days until the passengers were examined and then released by an Egyptian doctor. The ladies spent a couple of nights at the Hotel de Europe in Alexandria and were shown around by their dragoman, Elias Telhami, a Christian from Lebanon, who would be their guide in Egypt for the next 3.5 months. Here's his business card. The dragoman was a translator and guide who spoke both Arabic and various European languages. I could not find a picture of Monsieur Telhami, but here's a studio portrait of an Egyptian dragoman taken around 1880. Don't you think he'd be a colorful character to accompany you on your next Nile cruise? In Alexandria, they visited the harbor, the fort where the lighthouse once stood, Pompey's pillar, and the obelisk called Cleopatra's Needles. The fallen obelisk would be moved to London later in 1877, and the standing obelisk to New York in 1880. Amelia's adventures in Egypt were chronicled in her book, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. And as you will see, this trip changed Amelia's life. So now let's travel with Amelia and her friends as she starts out her journey, 1,000 miles up the Nile. First, it was off to Cairo by train. The rail crossed the Nile on swinging bridges at Kafir Zayat on the Rosetta branch and at Banha on the Damietta branch. They arrived at Cairo's central station on Sunday, November the 30th, 1873. It's now called the Ramses Station because a colossal statue of Ramses II was placed here in 1955. However, Ramses' statue was moved again in 2018 to the new Grand Egyptian Museum. In Cairo, Amelia, Lucy, and Jenny stayed, where else? At the famous Shepherd's Hotel. Shepherd's was built in 1841 by Samuel Shepherd. The original hotel was, in its Victorian elegant heyday, the place to be seen when in Cairo. The old Shepherd's was located near Uzbekia Square, a short distance from the railway station. Letters mailed from here were postmarked Shepherd's Hotel, as can be seen on this 1906 stamp from my own collection. Amelia says,
At Shepherd's assembled daily some 200 or 300 persons of all ranks, nationalities, and pursuits, half of whom are going up the Nile. Here are invalids in search of health, artists in search of subjects, sportsmen keen upon crocodiles, collectors on the scent of papyri and mummies, and the usual surplus of idlers who travel for the mere love of travel.
Shepherd's famous terrace, set with wicker chairs and tables, commanded a lofty and shaded view of the comings and goings on Ibrahim Pasha Street, where it is rumored ladies of the evening could be found. Unfortunately, the old Shepherd's burned down in 1952, and although it was rebuilt a mile away along the Nile, the new Shepherd's is nothing like its predecessor. Here's a short video to show you what it was like to stay at the original Shepherd's Hotel.
The grand entrance hall was done out in Pharaonic style with thick lotus-topped columns, and at the bottom of the main staircase was a pair of life-size bronze statues of bare-breasted women in ancient Egyptian headdresses, holding up electric lamps. Off the hall, there was reading, drawing and music rooms carpeted with plush Persian rugs.
Amelia says,
In Cairo, sightseeing should begin with a day in the native bazaars, neither buying nor sketching nor seeking information, but just taking in scene after scene. Every shop front, every street corner look as if they had been put there expressly to be painted.
Jenny Lane comments,
In Cairo, I saw a most curious sight. The people who keep carriages have their footmen run barefoot before the horses with a long stick in their hands to clear the way. Their dress is a short white skirt fastened under a gold embossed waistcoat and a turban. What would be thought of such a turnout in London?
the Egypt of 1873 was a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Khedive Ismail Pasha, grandson of Muhammad Ali. That's the original one, not the boxer. At that time, Egypt was still relatively unexplored and tourist visits had only begun. The Suez Canal had just opened in 1869, and slavery was not abolished until 4 years after Amelia's visit. There were no hotels south of Cairo, so travelers had to live on the boats that transported them up and down the Nile. Amelia tells us,
The history of ancient Egypt goes against the direction of the stream. Those travelers who hurry blindly forward, never resting until they have gained the farthest point of their journey upriver, begin at the wrong end and see all their sights in precisely inverse order. The Land of Egypt is a great book, not easily read, and difficult enough without the added puzzlement of being read backwards.
south of Cairo, the railway only went as far as Minya. To continue one's journey further south required passage either by steamer or sailboat. Take about a month by steamer to reach Aswan, and something like 2 months by sailboat, since they were dependent on the wind. South of Aswan, only sailboats could make it through the rapids of the First Cataract, and another month was needed to journey to the Second Cataract, the end of the line for boats traveling south. So the time required to reach the Second Cataract from Bristol, England was about 4 months. Amelia compares their two options to journey up the Nile.
The choice between a dahabeah and cook steamer is like the choice between traveling with post horses and traveling by rail. The first is expensive, leisurely, delightful. The other is cheap, swift, and comparatively comfortless. It seemed to us that the old-fashioned wooden dahabeah, flat-bottomed, drawing little water, and easily pulled off when stuck, was the one vessel best constructed for the navigation of the Nile. At Bulak, some 200 or 300 Nile boats lay moored for hire. The boats are all built on the same plan, except as they run bigger or smaller, cleaner or dirtier, and are as alike each other as twin oysters. The same may be said of their captains. Each rais, or captain, displays certificates given to him by former travelers. And these certificates have a mysterious way of turning up again and again on board different boats and in the hands of different captains.
It's Egypt, what can we say? For 10 days, Amelia and Lucy negotiated hiring a boat. Finally,
the difficulties were over and everything was settled. For in the place of a small boat for two, we had secured the Philae, at 100 feet long, one of the largest on the river. And instead of going alone, we had decided to throw in our lot with 3 other travelers who would meet with us further upriver.
the Philae required a large crew consisting of a captain, a steersman, 12 seamen, a cook, a sous chef, 2 waiters, and 1 boy to cook for the crew, 19 in all.
The whole cost of the Philae, including food, dragoman's wages, boat hire, and cataract, was 10 British pounds per day.
In 2021, this is equivalent to over $7,500 US a day. Not exactly traveling on a budget. Amelia's friends from the Simla, Marianne Brocklehurst, and her companion Mary Booth, who were nicknamed the MBs, chartered a smaller dahabeah to accompany the Philae on their voyage up the Nile. Marianne renamed their boat the Bagstones. Bagstones was the name of Marianne's summer estate. And here's the modest little Brocklehurst home, Swithamley Hall in Staffordshire, England. On board the Bagstones were the 2 MBs, plus Marianne's nephew Alfred and his manservant George. George was a colorful character described by Amelia.
The most amazing personage in our whole procession is unquestionably George. George is an English North Country groom whom the MBs have brought out from the wilds of Lancashire. George is groom, footman, housemaid, and general factotum all in one. And besides all this, he is gifted with a gravity of countenance that no surprises and no disasters can upset for a moment.
So doesn't he sound like P.G. Woodhouse's Jeeves?
To see him cantering along in his groom's coat and gaiters, livery buttons, spotted neckcloth, tall hat, and all the rest of it, his long legs dangling within an inch of the ground, on either side of the most diminutive of donkeys, one would have sworn that he and Egypt were friends of old.
The ladies' first combined outing to see the antiquities was a visit to the pyramids of Giza.
When at last the edge of the desert is reached, the long sandy slope climbed, and the great pyramid, in all its unexpected bulk and majesty, towers over one's head, the effect is as sudden as it is overwhelming. It shuts out the sky and the horizon. It shuts out all the other pyramids. It shuts out everything except a sense of awe and wonder.
Marianne's diary records,
December 2nd, we go to the pyramids of Giza. Alfred made the ascent, but we ladies were content just to visit the tombs and ramble about the Sphinx.
by the way, climbing a pyramid is difficult. I've done it myself. When you get to the top, some 400 feet up the 51-degree slope, and realize the only way back down are giant 3 to 4 foot high, slippery, sand-covered steps, well, it's pretty scary. The next day, the travelers boarded their dahabeyas to journey upriver. Amelia says,
At last, all is ready. The captain stands at the head of the steps. The steersman is at the helm. The dragoman has loaded his musket. Is the other boat ready? We wave a handkerchief of inquiry. The signal is answered. The mooring ropes are loosened and the sailors pull the boat off the bank. Bang go the guns, 6 from the fillet and 6 from the bagstones. And away we go, our huge sail filling as it takes the wind.
Jenny comments in her diary about the fillet.
I am delighted with our Nile home. It is a charming boat, beautifully fitted up. A nice large saloon, 7 cabins, 1 with a large double bed, and 3 bathrooms. My cabin is 4 foot 7 inches wide and 6 foot 8 inches long. A perfect little picture. The sailors are all black, wear large white turbans, and blue and white cotton drawers to their knees. Below that, their feet and legs are bare.
So here's the sort of cabin, that small cabin that Jenny stayed in. For comparison, here's a luxury cabin on a modern dahabeya. Not bad, eh? Amelia describes their boat.
A dahabeya carries 2 masts, a big one near the prow and a smaller one at the stern. The cabins occupy the stern of the vessel. The roof of the cabins form the raised deck. This upper deck is reached from the lower deck by little flights of steps, and it is the exclusive territory of the passengers. The lower deck is the territory of the crew.
And you may recognize this dahabeya as Neferu Ra, the one that Bill Petty used to own.
The filet's kitchen contains only a charcoal stove and a row of stew pans. How these men can serve up the elaborate dinners, which are the pride of a Nile cook's heart, is wonderful. But how they achieve these same results when wind and sandstorms are blowing is little short of miraculous.
I second that one because that was Bill's chef who was excellent on the move. This is what the dining room in a dahabeya looked like during Victorian times. Amelia also purchased a piano and had it installed in their boat. Just imagine hearing this music while sailing on the Nile. So not only would they dress for dinner each night, there would be music and song afterwards. And no doubt the gentlemen, though, would have to rough it, take their port and cigars up on the open deck. Amelia says,
We sit on the high upper deck, which is furnished with lounge chairs, tables, and foreign rugs, like a drawing room in the open air.
this view looks towards the south. You can see how the narrow Nile River Valley is surrounded on both sides by Egypt's eastern and western deserts. The Nile flows from the higher ground in the south of Egypt down into the Mediterranean Sea in the north. Because of this, the southern part is called Upper Egypt and the northern part Lower Egypt. As we proceed upriver from Cairo, I'll show you Google Earth views on each section of the Nile, just before Amelia describes her experiences there. The first stops were at Saqqara, Beni Suef, and Minya. Arriving at Saqqara, Marianne wrote,
December 14, we joined Miss Edwards and Miss Renshaw with donkeys for a day amongst the pyramids and tombs at Saqqara. The mutual dinner parties given and champagne that has flowed need not be mentioned here.
Amelia describes her first view of Saqqara.
High on this barren plateau, there stands a solemn company of pyramids. The colors are not to be matched with any pigments yet invented. The Libyan rocks like rusty gold. The warm maze of the nearer pyramids take on a tender tint of rose. All this is beautiful in a way impossible to describe, and alas, impossible to copy. Here at Saqqara, the whole plateau is strewn with scraps of broken pottery, bleached bones, shreds of yellow linen, and lumps of odd-looking dark brown substance, like dried up sponge. With a shock, we discover these scattered bones are human. Those shreds are pieces of shroud cloths, and those brown lumps and fragments of what was once living flesh. For the first time, we realize that every inch of this ground on which we are standing are violated graves. We soon become hardened to such sights, and so we rummage among dusty sepulchres with no more compunction than would have befitted a gang of professional body snatchers. Most Egyptian travelers, if questioned, would have to make a similar confession.
The party then explores Mit Rahina, the site of the ancient city of Memphis. Amelia says,
We are in the midst of palm woods, threading our way among the mounds. We gather around the brink of a muddy pool, in the midst of which lies a shapeless block of blackened and corroded limestone. This, it seems, is the famous prostrate colossus of Ramses the Great. Where, however, is the companion colossus?
here's a photo of the colossus after it was rescued from its swamp 14 years after Amelia's visit. If you've been to the open air museum at Memphis, Ramses is still there. And if you saw the 1987 Ramses II exhibit here in Denver, the companion statue of Ramses found in 1961 was on display. Amelia continues,
Where is the temple? Where are the pylons, the obelisks, the avenues of sphinxes? Where, in short, is Memphis? The dragoman shrugs his shoulders and points to the barren mounds among the palms. They stand some 40 feet above the plain. Nothing grows upon them. One looks in vain for any sign which might indicate the outline of a boundary wall or the position of a great public building. Is this all that remains of Memphis, eldest of cities?
the Abeas then sail further up the Nile and stop at Beni Suif. Amelia comments,
The town, we are told, does not have a first-rate reputation. Guards are hired, but they fall asleep as the evening wears on. However, the bad characters of Beni Suif are very wide awake. Later, I hear a man swim softly round the fillet. The whole boat is instantly in an uproar. Lanterns are lighted, sailors search the ship, and our dragoman loads his gun. But the thief slips quietly away in the night like a fish.
the next day, continuing towards Minya, Amelia tells us,
We are honored with a visit by a Muslim named Holy Sheikh Cotton. He makes his appearance, swimming with his garments twisted into a huge turban on top of his head and only his chin above water. He presents himself on deck and receives a huge welcome. All dripping and smiling, he proceeds to touch the tiller, the ropes, and the ends of the yards, in order, says our dragoman, to make them holy. We are told that from this moment on, nothing can go wrong on a dahabeah that has been blessed by Holy Sheikh Cotton. We are certain to have favorable winds, to pass the cataracts without accident, and to come back safely.
the tradition of blessing a ship is still done today. Here's the Bishop of Norwich, England, blessing a fishing trawler as it heads out to sea. At Minya, Amelia met up with the 3 other passengers who arrived from Cairo by train. She writes,
The newcomers consist of the painter and the happy couple. The stern cabin is given to the painter for a studio. It contains frames, canvases, drawing paper, and easels, enough to start a provincial school of art. The happy couple are on their wedding tour. The bridegroom is what the world chooses to call an idle man. That is to say, he has scholarship, delicate health, and leisure.
from Jenny's diary, we learned that the painter is the British artist Andrew McCallum, and the happy couple are Mr. and Mrs. Ayer, whom Amelia also refers to as the idle man, and his wife, the little lady. South of Minya are Akhenaten's ancient city at Amarna, the cliffs of Gebel Abu Feda, the provincial town of Asiut, and the temples at Abydos. Setting out from Minya, they endured a whole morning of tracking. Amelia says,
We had heard about tracking since coming to Egypt, but without any idea of the process. Coming up on deck, we found 9 of our poor fellows harnessed to a rope like barge horses, towing the huge boat. We got used to it, as one gets used to everything in time, but it looked like slaves' work and shocked our English notions disagreeably.
These are ancient Egyptian scenes of tracking, pre-dynastic above and pharaonic below. You can almost hear them chanting. Amelia describes daily life under dahabeah.
Sometimes as many as 100 chickens are on board. The poultry yard is railed off at the end of the stern. Lucy and the little lady feed these hapless prisoners with breakfast scraps every morning, to the profound amusement of the steersman, who, unable to conceive any other motive, imagines we are fattening them for the table.
On reaching the cliffs of Gebel Abu Feda near Amarna, Amelia comments,
"The cliffs are rent into strange forms, honeycombed with rock-cut tombs, and undermined by water-washed caverns, in which lurk a few lingering crocodiles. The tombs number many hundreds. For nearly 12 miles, the range runs parallel to the river, and throughout that distance, the face of the cliff is pierced with innumerable doorways."
Here are those tomb openings. We next encounter a mystery. Amelia says,
"Less than halfway along the length of the range, I observed 2 large stelae incised upon the face of the cliff, at a height of perhaps 150 feet above the river. These stelae, sculptured side by side, may have measured some 15 feet in height. The boat was going so fast that to sketch the hieroglyphs was impossible. Coming back several months later, I looked for them again, but without success, for the midday sun was then pouring full upon the rocks and obliterating all shallow detail. While watching for the stelae, I noticed a colossal relief high up on the face of a cliff. The figure could not have measured less than 20 feet in height. I immediately drew Lucy's attention to the spot, and she not only discerned the figure, but believed that she could see traces of a second.
the location of these mysterious stelae are currently unknown. They were probably some of the boundary stela of Akhenaten city at Amarna, like boundary stela U, which is pictured here. Sailing upriver past Asiut, Amelia says,
We see what seems to be a very large grizzled ape perched on the top of the western bank. A strange excitement breaks out among our crew. They shout, they gesticulate. The captain salams. All eyes are turned towards the shore. "Do you see Sheikh Salim?" cries our dragoman. "There he is." We find out that it is not a monkey, but a man. And not only a man, but a saint. Holiest of the holy, dirtiest of the dirty, withered, bent, and knotted up. Naked and unwashed, he has sat on that same spot every day through summer heat and winter cold for the last 50 years. He is not nice to look at, even at this distance, but the sailors think him quite beautiful and call aloud to him for his blessing as we go by.
after stopping at the temples of Abydos and Dendera, the Philae reached Luxor, the religious capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom. The temple of Seti I at Abydos was built around 1300 BCE. It has 7 sanctuaries dedicated to 6 Egyptian gods, and of course Seti himself. Amelia describes its scenes.
The Temple of Seti is one of the most beautiful of Egyptian ruins. Almost every subject in the temple is new and strange. All the gods of the Egyptian pantheon seem to have been worshipped here, and each has a separate shrine. The walls are covered with paintings of these shrines and their occupants, while before each, the king is represented performing some act of adoration.
A little south of Abydos is the temple at Dendera, dedicated to Hathor. Additions to this temple were made by a number of pharaohs, including the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra VII, and even later on by the Romans. Amelia says,
Not, however, till we stood immediately under those ponderous columns did we realize the immense proportions of the building. The effect is one of overwhelming majesty. The portico's breadth, height, and massiveness exceed in grandeur all that has been and one has been anticipating throughout the long 2 miles of approach.
the next day they arrived at Luxor, the ancient city called Thebes by the Greeks, the city of 100 gates. Amelia writes,
Luxor is a large village inhabited by a mixed population of Copts and Arabs doing a smart trade in antiquities. The grand entrance of Luxor Temple faces north, looking down towards Karnak. The twin towers of the great pylon, dilapidated as they are magnificent still. In front of them, on each side of the central gateway, sit two helmeted colossi buried to the chin. A few yards in front of these stands a solitary obelisk.
Amelia's sketch was very accurate. Compare it to the 1860 photograph by Francis Frith. Amelia continues,
Beyond the entrance of Luxor Temple lay a smoky, filthy, intricate labyrinth of lanes and passages, mud hovels, mud pigeon towers, mud yards, and a mud mosque clustered like wasp nests in and about the ruins. The winding alleys masked the colonnades and defaced the inscriptions of the pharaohs.
Mary Ann writes,
January 9. We spend the afternoon among Karnak's immense halls and gorgeous ruins. Alfred shoots a fox and thinks more of it than the ruins, naturally.
Amelia is a little more descriptive.
I seem to remember as if it had all happened in a dream. We approached the great temple's main entrance. We entered upon what had once been a great avenue of ram-headed sphinxes, leading from some grand landing place beside the Nile. The towers rose straight before us, magnificent in ruin. An immense perspective of pillars and pylons, leading to a very distant obelisk, opened out before us. We went in, the great walls towering up like cliffs above our heads, and entered the first court. Here, open to the sky, stands a solitary column, the last of a central avenue of 12, some of which lie just as they fell. Crossing this court, we came to a mighty doorway between two more pylons. The pylons were mere cataracts of fallen blocks, piled up to right and left in grand confusion. The doorway must have been a full 100 feet in height. We went on, leaving a mutilated colossus engraved with a cartouche of Ramses II. We passed into the famous hypostyle hall of Seti I. The hypostyle hall is a place that much has been written about and often painted, but of which no writing and no art can convey more than a dwarfed and pallid impression. It is a place that strikes you into silence. For as long as I have memory, the great hall of Karnak is photographed in some dark corner of my brain. I shut my eyes and see it as if I were there. Have I not said it was like a dream?
There's a reconstruction of what the first courtyard of the Amun Temple at Karnak looked like thousands of years ago, covering over 200 acres. It's the largest religious building site in the world. But as you can see, Karnak was pretty much in ruins when Amelia visited. Today, Karnak Temple has been reassembled from the rubble of Amelia's time. Notice how small people look standing by the entry where the 90-foot-high temple doors once opened. Amelia says,
Lucy and I did our fair share of antica hunting at Luxor. The game, it is true, was prohibited, but we enjoyed it nonetheless because it was illegal. Perhaps we enjoyed it more. There were whispers of a tomb that had been discovered on the western side, a wonderful tomb, rich in all kinds of treasures. No one, of course, had seen these things. No one knew who had found them. No one knew where they were hidden. Dark hints were dropped of a possible papyrus, and the MBs babbled of mummies. Neither Lucy nor I desired to become the happy proprietor of an ancient Egyptian, but the papyrus was a thing to be thought of. We expressed a wish to see it, and from that moment on, every mummy snatcher in the place regarded us as his lawful prey. The houses at Gurna are built over tombs, and in one, a mummy was stowed away in a recess at the end of a long rock-cut passage. We tried in vain to get sight of the coveted papyrus. An Arab offered it with the mummy for 100 pounds. He haggled for a day or two, evidently trying to play us off against some rival, and then disappeared. These rivals, we afterwards found, were the MBs. They bought both mummy and papyrus at an enormous price, smuggled it on board their boat, and then, unable to endure the perfume of their ancient Egyptian, drowned their dear departed at the end of a week.
Well, that does not exactly agree with Mary Ann's version.
It was on the Simla that we had first heard of this interesting creature. A celebrated artist promised to introduce us should fate bring us together. Curiously enough, it happened, as the MBs, riding among the ruins of Thebes, were hailed by a friendly call of "Hi there, Bagstones," from a tent in which sat the artist hard at work. The result was a halt and a glass of Bordeaux. Afterwards, we went up the rocky hill together to the house where the Arab family resided.
Now, Mary Ann and Amelia had blundered into the home of the famous grave-robbing family, the Rassouls, who just 2 years earlier had stumbled on the DB-320 cache of 50 royal mummies. In 1983, I met Hussein Rassoul, pictured here, the last survivor of Howard Carter's team that discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. It was his grandfather, Muhammad Rassoul, who had dealt with Amelia and Mary Ann. Mary Ann continues.
We proceeded underground through several rooms. Here we found the mummy in its very pretty painted case, all enclosed in a wooden sarcophagus more than an inch in thickness, which from its size and weight was necessarily out of all question in a smuggling point of view. We liked the mummy case's looks, however, and we liked the idea of smuggling on a large scale under the nose of the Pasha's guards. Afterwards, we again visited their den, this time to see a fine papyrus, which was included in the bargain. It was agreed that George and one of the other Arabs were to carry the mummy case down to our boat after dark and put it in through the window. At last, we had our mummy case safe in our cabin. It looked quite pretty in its paint and hieroglyphics. We declared it to be a festive object and not at all an old funeral front. When the top of the case was lifted and the thrilling moment arrived, our hopes were scattered by finding the mummy of a little boy, about 12 years old. No ornaments, papyrus, scarabs, not even a little god or two had been placed on his person. We carefully wrapped the bandages of cloth around him again, and the little mummy was buried by night with great secrecy and left in his native land.
Later, Dr. Birch at the British Museum translated the coffin and found that the little boy mummy had actually been a young girl, Sheb Mut, singer in the inner sanctuary of the temple. Upriver from Luxor, past Armant, lie the ancient temples of Esna, Edfu, and Kamambo. The farthest up the Nile a Cook steamer could go was 112 miles south of Luxor at Aswan. And beyond that, the rapids of the First Cataract could only be traversed with a dahabeah. The dahabeahs continued on toward Esna. Amelia says,
The wind rose next morning with the sun, and by breakfast time, we had left Armant far behind. All that day, the good breeze served us well. The Philae put on her best speed. The little Bagstones kept up gallantly, and the Fostat, a large iron dahabeah full of English gentlemen, kept us close company all the afternoon. We were all bound for Esna, a large trading town.
Mary Ann records in her diary,
January 12th. The Bagstones is first into Esna. We bazaar on our own, and for 5 English pounds get 300 eggs, 38 chickens, 4 geese, 2 sheep, half a cow, and vegetables. This, with our present store, will provision us for a month.
Amelia comments,
We had been told there was a temple at Esna and that it was close to the marketplace. A camel driver pointed to a dilapidated wooden gateway between 2 neighboring houses. We were greatly puzzled. We expected to see the temple towering above the surrounding houses and could by no means understand how any large building should not be visible from without. A little crowd gathered, and I expressed my opinion that there was ma fiche berbe, no temple at all. Whereupon a dozen voices were raised to assure me that the berbe was no myth, that it was kabir, big, that it was kwais, beautiful, and that all the Ingles came to see it. In the midst of the clamor, the gate creaks open. The gentlemen of the Fostat trooped out, and we are at last admitted. There was, Beyond the doorway, the curved cornice of a mighty temple, a temple neither ruined nor defaced, but buried to the chin in the accumulated rubbish of a score of centuries. We stand under a row of huge capitals. The columns that support them are buried beneath our feet.
When I visited Esna Temple in 1983, the temple had been cleared down to the ground level. And looking up in the hypostyle hall, I noticed that one of my relatives, George Pepper, Dublin, Ireland, 1858, had left his name carved high up on one of the columns at the old ground level. It was shocking to find vandals in my family. The next morning, the Philae, Bagstones, and Fostat leave Esna bound for Edfu. Amelia tells us,
As the languid afternoon wears on, the pylons of Edfu loom out of the misty distance. The breeze, such as it was, has dropped. The river stretches away before us, smooth and oily as a pond. 9 of the men are tracking. Will they pull us to Edfu in time to see the temple before nightfall? Rais Hassan looks doubtful. Suddenly, the trackers stop, look back, shout, and point joyously to a white streak breaking across the smooth surface of the river, about half a mile behind. For the capricious wind that always springs up when we don't want it is coming. The Fostat flings out her big sail and catches the first puff. The Bagstone's turn comes next. The Philae shakes her wings free and shoots ahead. And in fewer minutes than it takes to tell, we are all 3 scudding along before a glorious breeze. The great towers of Edfu are soon passed and left behind.
all 3 boats find themselves rushing towards Aswan. Amelia says,
With that instinct of rivalry, it is the Philae against the Fostat and the Bagstones against both. In plain English, it is a race. The Dahabeyas are pretty equally matched. We pass and repass, and we are as eager to win as if a great prize depended on it. The next day, the race goes on. Last night, we raced for glory. Today, we race for a stake. A guinea for Rais Hassan if we get first to Aswan. No need to call up the dragoman to interpret between us. Our captain casts a backward glance at the pursuing Dahabeyas, a forward glance in the direction of Aswan. By the light in his eye, Rais Hassan means winning.
Notice the determined look on this captain's face? Amelia continues her description of the Dahabeya race.
To be first in Aswan means to be first on the governor's list and first up the cataract. At breakfast time, we were 15 miles from Aswan. Now it has gone down to 10, and the Fostat creeping closer every minute. Rais Hassan stands motionless at his post, on the lookout for shallows. It is no longer 6 miles, but 5. Then the Fostat, thanks to her bigger sail, has overtaken us, and the Bagstones is not more than 100 yards behind. On we go till the corner is turned and the minarets of Aswan are seen in the distance. Suddenly, the Fostat is beside us. For a couple of breathless seconds, the 2 Dahabeyas plunge onward side by side, making for that narrow passage which is only wide enough for one. In that moment, Rais Hassan gives the word. The Philae bounds forward, takes the channel from under the very bows of the Fostat, and dips right away into the deep water, leaving her rival hard and fast among the shallows. And so ends our memorable race of nearly 68 miles from Edfu to Aswan.
Mary Ann says,
January 15. The scenery here in Aswan is quite changed. Great granite rocks are piled up on each side of the river and form an island elephantine in the middle. It is very curious and pretty here. We first see the deep golden, almost orange sand drifts of Nubia, contrasting with the dark granite rocks very strangely.
after exploring Aswan's Bazaar, Elephantine Island, and on camels, the unfinished obelisk quarry, which now looks like this, the 3 Dahabeyas are ready to take on the first cataract and continue their journey up the Nile. In 1873, both the low and high dams at Aswan had not yet been built. The entire length of what is now Lake Nasser was a winding river valley filled with Nubian villages and temples along its banks. Mary Ann writes about being towed through the first cataract.
January 17. On arriving at the first cataract, We find a heavy, strong current flowing over dangerous rocks, and we do not find the 300 men promised by the sheikh. So we have to wait an hour or two. At last, the Philae, which is first, gets into tow. The Arabs scream, everybody directs. A great many look on, and a few pull at the ropes. The great ship struggles up, and it is our turn next.
The first cataract has 5 babs, which is Arabic for gates. The first is the Bab el Kabir, the big one in Arabic. Winston Churchill commented it was only 35 feet wide and the river dropped 10 feet in a single bound. This makes it a class 5 rapids. It would have been very difficult to rescue anyone who falls into the water. Marianne on the Bagstones continues.
Second day of cataract. Men come later than expected. Another bab is accomplished. Third day. At last, the Philae gets tugged up the third bab after breaking her rope and nearly getting smashed. We do the same thing and anchor soon after. Fourth day. Safely above the rapids at 12 o'clock. And now the row about baksheesh begins.
Baksheesh is tip money. The flotilla arrives at the island of Philae. And Amelia says,
seen from a small boat, the island with its palms, its colonnades, and its pylons seems to rise out of the river like a mirage. All looks stately, perfect. One forgets that anything is changed. If a sound of antique chanting were to be borne along the quiet air, if a procession of white-robed priests bearing aloft the veiled ark of the god were to come sweeping round between the palms and the pylons, we should not think it strange.
a few years later, artist Frederick Arthur Bridgman painted the very scene that Amelia had imagined. A processions of priests bring the sacred bark to visit Isis, the goddess of Philae Temple. A bark is a miniature boat holding the statue of the god. The ladies explore Philae Temple. Amelia writes,
a wonderful scene opens before our eyes. We are standing at the lower end of a courtyard leading up to the pylons of the great temple. The courtyard is enclosed on either side by covered colonnades. The twin towers of the pylon are very nearly as perfect as in the days of the Ptolemies who built them. The broad area between the colonnades is honeycombed with vestiges of a Coptic village of early Christian time.
Here's a modern view of that same scene. David Roberts painted the grand portico at Philae Temple in 1838 and compare it with Amelia's sketch of the very same scene. After leaving Philae, the dahabeah is headed upriver into Nubia. Along the course of the Nile, it now lies under Lake Nasser. And Amelia says,
sailing southward, the river opening wide before us, we are now over the border. And if Egypt was strange and far from home, Nubia is stranger and farther still. The Nile here flows deep and broad. The rocky heights that hem it in so close on either side are black on the one hand, golden on the other. When on board, we keep a sharp lookout for crocodiles. We see their tracks upon the sandbanks in the river. The farther south we go, the more impatient we become. Alfred, who has set his heart on bagging at least half a dozen, says nothing, but grows gloomier day by day.
but here's why you might want to have a little respect for Crocodilus niloticus. And by the way, they can attack at speeds of up to 30 miles an hour. While journeying upriver through Nubia, the dahabeah stopped at numerous temples. In the 1960s, when the construction of the Aswan High Dam threatened to submerge these monuments under Lake Nasser, several temples were moved to foreign countries who offered to save them. Dibad, built in the early 2nd century BCE, was originally constructed by the Kushite king of Meroe and dedicated to Amun and Isis. It was moved to Madrid, Spain. Dendur, a tiny temple with a single pylon, was built by the Roman governor of Egypt, Petronius, around 15 BCE. It was dedicated to Isis and Osiris. It's now in New York. Kalabsha was constructed during the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus and dedicated to the Nubian god Mandulus. It's one of 3 temples which were relocated to Aswan. Several Nubian temples were left where they were built, but moved to higher ground above the flood level of the lake. Amada, dedicated to Amun and Ra-Harakti, was transported in one piece on rails and put high above Lake Nasser. Amelia says,
Amada was built during the reign of Thutmose III. Nowhere had we seen bas-reliefs so delicately modeled, so rich in color. The figures are slender and animated. The headdresses, jewelry, and patterned robes are elaborately drawn and painted. Every head looks like a portrait. In the darkest corner of the atrium, we observe the king embraced by a goddess. On his head, he wears the keprish, or war helmet.
A month after leaving Aswan, they arrived at the town of Carrasco. Amelia comments,
The approach to Carrasco is more picturesque than anything we had yet seen south of the cataract. As the dust deepened, the moon rose, and the palms that had just room to grow between the mountains and the river turned from bronze to silver. Here, the great caravan route leads off across the desert to Khartoum.
Carrasco is flooded by the Aswan High Dam and it no longer exists. Over 100,000 Nubians were displaced when the dam created Lake Nasser. At last they reach Abu Simbel. Amelia tells us,
The great temple stood before us. Though it was night and they were still not much less than a mile away, the four colossi came out, ghost-like, vague and shadowy in the enchanted moonlight. Even as we watched them, they seemed to grow and be moving toward us out of the silvery distance.
Abu Simbel was constructed by Ramses II, dedicated around 1260 BCE to the gods Ra-Harakti, Amun, and of course, Ramses himself. The Great Temple and its smaller companion temple were relocated to higher ground in 1964 by UNESCO at a cost of $40 million. Amelia says,
It was towards midnight when the Philae arrived and moored under the great temple. We went and stood at the feet of the colossi, beyond which was darkness. The great statues towered above our heads. The river glittered like steel in the far distance, and there was a keen silence in the air. As we stood talking there with bated breath, the time, the place, even the sound of our own voices seemed unreal. I felt as if the whole scene must fade with the moonlight and vanish before morning. We spent 14 days at the foot of the great temple. The heat on shore was great, especially in the sketching tents. But the north breeze blew steadily every day from about an hour after sunrise till an hour before sunset. And on board the dahabeah, it was always cool.
here's a composite picture of what Abu Simbel looks like today and 3,000 years ago. Amelia continues,
With arrivals and departures of other dahabeahs, exchange of visits, exhibitions of sketches, and social visits of various kinds, we had quite a gay time. The Philae gave a dinner party and fantasia under the very noses of the colossi. Every evening there was drumming and howling enough among the assembled crews to raise the ghosts of Ramses and all his queens. This was pleasant enough while it lasted, but when the strangers dropped off one by one, and at the end of 3 days, we were once more alone, I think we were not sorry. After the other dahabeahs left, our painter conceived the idea of setting our sailors to clean the face of the northernmost colossus. It was still disfigured by the plaster cast taken by Robert Hay more than half a century before. A scaffolding of spars and oars was improvised. The men were soon swarming all over the huge head, just as the carvers swarmed over it in the days when Ramses was king. All they had to do was to tint the white patches with coffee. This they did with bits of sponge tied to the ends of sticks. Ramses' appetite for coffee was prodigious. He consumed I know not how many gallons a day. The coffee proved a capital match for the sandstone. We succeeded in obliterating those ghastly splotches, which for many years have marred this beautiful face with the unsightliness of leprosy. Then, on February 16, 1874, an event occurred that roused us to a pitch of excitement. At 11 a.m., the painter went strolling about among the rocks. Passing the front of the great temple, on the southeast corner, he saw a long crack running down the face of the rock. He poked in the point of his stick and found that it penetrated to a depth of 2 or 3 feet. Meanwhile, the luncheon bell having rung, We concluded the painter had rambled off somewhere into the desert and sat down without him. Towards the close of the meal, however, came a penciled note. "Come immediately. I have found the entrance to a tomb. And please send some sandwiches." Signed A. McC. In less than 10 minutes, we were there, asking breathless questions, peeping in through the fast widening aperture, and helping to clear away the sand. All that Sunday afternoon, we toiled upon our hands and knees under the burning sun. By sunset, the top of the doorway of the speos, or grotto, was laid bare, into which our crewman, Muhammad Ali, was the first to squeeze his way in. We passed him a candle and a box of matches. "What can you see?"
Wonderful things? No, sorry, that was a different tune. Amelia continues.
He came out, saying that it was a most beautiful berbe. I wiggled in next and found myself looking into a small square chamber. There was light enough to see every detail distinctly. The painted frieze running round just under the ceiling, and the bas-relief sculptures on the walls, gorgeous with unfaded color. During the next 2 days, I copied paintings and inscriptions. The idle man and the painter took measurements and surveyed to make out the plan. The rock-cut chamber, which I have hitherto described as a speos, and which at first believed to be a tomb, was in fact neither. It was the sacred space of a chapel dedicated to the god Thoth and made at the same time as the great temple.
Here's a modern photo of how the entrance to the chapel appears today. It's behind an iron gate just left of the 4 colossal statues. Amelia says of the smaller temple at Abu Simbel, dedicated to Ramses' wife Nefertari,
The whole front is but a frame for 6 recesses, from each of which a colossal statue, erect and lifelike, seems to be walking straight out from the heart of the mountain. These statues stand 30 feet high and represent Ramses II and Nefertari, his queen. The queen wears on her head the plumes and disc of Hathor. The king is crowned with both the double crown and a fantastic helmet adorned with plumes and horns. They have their children with them, the queen her daughters, the king his sons, infants only 10 feet high, whose heads just reach to the parental knee.
Philae then continued on to its most southern destination, near Wadi Halfa in the Second Cataract of the Nile. Wadi Halfa was the end of the line for most Nile travelers, unless they joined a camel caravan heading to Khartoum. The original site of Wadi Halfa is now under the waters of Lake Nubia, the Sudanese name for Lake Nasser. The town was, though, relocated to higher ground in 1964. Arriving at the southernmost point of their journey, Amelia writes,
The Second Cataract consists, like the First Cataract, of a succession of rocks and rapids, and is skirted for the first 5 miles or so by a sand cliff ridge. This ridge terminates abruptly in the famous precipice known as the Rock of Abu Sir. The summit of the rock is steep and overhanging, and carved all over with autographs in stone. We found Belzoni's name, but looked in vain for the signatures of Burckhardt, Champollion, Lepsius, and Ampere. Divided into hundreds of separate channels, the cataract spreads far and wide for a distance of more than 16 miles. It is hard, now that we are actually here, to realize that this is the end of our journey. To the south, pale but distinct on the outermost rim of the world, rise 2 mountain summits. Comparing our position upon the map, we come to the conclusion that the 2 mountains are situated about 10 miles below the Third Cataract, and consequently 1,000 miles from the start of our journey up the Nile.
Here's one of the mountains seen by Amelia, just south of the Third Cataract. Amelia and her friends then headed back down the Nile. During their return journey, they stopped at sites overlooked on the way upstream. It would take another month to return downstream to Cairo. Marianne concludes their story of their trip to Egypt.
April 15. On the arrival of the Dahabeah at Cairo, we got all our valuables, which were already boxed, on shore, and the guards unsuspectingly let them pass on our way to the railway station. At Alexandria, we were equally fortunate. and got everything bribed on board the steamer without difficulty.
Mary Ann's collection of over 500 antiquities included Sheb Boot's mummy case, a small statue of Queen T, a Ushabti of Penejim II, and a stela of Merneptah. Her papyrus, a Book of the Dead for Baku, now called the Brocklehurst Papyrus, is in the Kestner Museum in Hanover, Germany. Mary Ann's antiquities are now on view at the West Park Museum in Macclesfield, England. She built the museum specifically to house her Egyptian collection. These pages are from Amelia's sketchbook, only recently discovered in the archives at Oxford University. After her trip to Egypt, Amelia began giving talks on the lives of the ancient Egyptians and corresponding with Egyptologists Auguste Mariette and Gaston Maspero. When Swiss archaeologist Edward Neville put a letter in the Morning Post asking for financial support for archaeological excavation in Egypt, Amelia decided to help. In 1882, Amelia and Reginald Poole, an employee of the British Museum, founded the Egypt Exploration Fund. Its aim to excavate and preserve Egyptian monuments. Amelia gave up all of her other interests so she could concentrate on being the EEF's secretary and publicize its cause. And in case you were wondering, the EEF still exists, but it now calls itself the Egypt Exploration Society. This letter from Amelia to Reginald Poole shows that she signs off with a drawing of the secretary bird, Thoth. In 1889 to 90, to promote the EEF, Amelia went on a lecture tour, speaking at 120 different locations across America. The content of these lectures was published in Amelia's book, Pharaohs, Fellas, and Explorers. In it, she declares,
"The Valley of the Nile is one great museum. Each season beholds the exploration of new sites, and each explorer has some new thing to tell. Time augments rather than diminishes Egypt's everlasting novelty."
One of Amelia's most important lectures was her presentation titled The Social and Political Position of Women in Ancient Egypt. It chastised British women for having fewer legal and social rights than Egyptian women had attained thousands of years before. Soon afterwards, Amelia was appointed vice president of the Bristol and West of England's Women's Suffrage League. For her work in Egyptology, Amelia was awarded 3 honorary degrees. In 1892, at age only 61, Amelia Edwards died from bronchitis. In her will, she left her large collection of books and her antiquities to University College in London, and they became the core objects in the college's Egyptian Museum. Amelia also left 5,000 British pounds for the establishment of the first English chair of Egyptian archaeology at University College. Its first holder was the famous archaeologist Flinders Petrie. Amelia was buried at Henbury Churchyard in Bristol, England. Her epitaph reads,
"Here lies the body of Amelia Ann Blandford Edwards, novelist and archaeologist, who by her writings and her labors enriched the thoughts and interests of her time."
So we hope you have enjoyed sailing the Nile with David, Jill, and Amelia. Thanks for traveling with us.